So I want to read a quick quote from the introduction where you describe who your audience for this book is. You have a few different categories. One is the proverbial NPR listening, New York Times reading crowd that is thought of as white, but is really, multiracial. And you and I would be as much a part of as we are of the Black community. And then you have the second category, which was so beautifully phrased that it gave me goosebumps to read. And this is to Black people who have fallen under the misimpression that for us only, cries of weakness constitute a kind of strength, and that for us only what makes us interesting, what makes us matter, is a curated persona as eternally victimized souls, ever carrying and defined by the memories and injuries of our people across the 4 centuries behind us, ever unrecognized, ever misunderstood, ever in assorted senses unpaid. So this is
not bad, is it?
Not bad at all. Not bad at all, John.
I don't read my own stuff, but yeah, it's interesting to hear that read back to me.
Well, it struck a chord with me because, the curated persona, the sense that for us only, this kind of pose of appropriating the grievances of the last 7 generations of our heritage and curating that into a persona gives you this, in certain subcultures and more in the culture, gives you this enormous power. It's from the buffet of potential personalities you're choosing from as a young person. This has emerged as a really attractive option for people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And it has a very sketchy relationship to the truth of any individual's life, and an even sketchier relationship to sort of common sense wisdom about how to be a well-adjusted person, which is, I've often said that much of what third wave anti-racism or intersectionality suggests, much of the wisdom it suggests about how to live your life is as if you asked a therapist who deals with trauma all the advice they would give to somebody, and then you just flip it on its head. Just like dwell as much as possible on things you cannot control, on the pain experienced by your ancestors, on the way in which no matter how small the world has been unfair to you, magnify them as much as possible, and be as suspicious as possible of other people's motives, assume the worst in people. It's just so that really struck a chord with me, and so maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
The best source on that, as I'm sure you know, is Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, where they make the invaluable point. It's never gotten around as much as it should have. I mean, this book, in a way, really should get around as much as Guns, Germs, and Steel, as much as Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. These are really crucial ideas. And what they're basically saying is that what we're taught is the right way to be a Black person. It's partly this kind of college campus language, but especially Black people and maybe Latino people too, is exactly what you would not learn from somebody who's trained in what cognitive health is. And somehow it's different when you're talking about descendants of African slaves. And, I'm always reluctant to say that Black people who settle into this way of thinking are seeking power, because I consider it the last resort to accuse people of shifty motives. They usually don't have them. Usually you can come up with some way of seeing them where they think they're doing good, they're innocent, but they're just falling into something about which we must ask some questions. But there is a power, depending on what you call power. And so, for example, if you're going to adopt that view of your own Blackness and that of your fellow Black people, it's pretty easy to do academic work, to get an academic job, to engage in intellection these days, because there exists a huge number of people who are ready to lap it up. So you have a certain power there. It's very easy to get a lot of attention writing from that perspective. And even socially, I remember when I was a teenager going through the usual kind of acne festooned insecurities, and especially being, a middle-class Black kid in mostly white private schools. And everybody should remember this isn't 1942. It's, say, 1980, which is kind of poised between our time and the old time. I didn't know the old time, but 1980 wasn't quite now either. And so I used to sometimes overdo it. That will surprise many people. I remember accusing this one white woman of not wanting me. She had shushed me because she said my voice was too loud and was supposed to be quiet studying time. And I do have a loud voice, but I was embarrassed because she did it in front of a girl I liked. And so I said, "You're just doing this because I'm Black." And it had a certain power. Thank God she didn't break down crying or anything, but I could tell it hurt her. Yeah. But there was a part of me not long after that thought, is this the way I want to be a big dude for the rest of my life? Is that the way I'm going to be special? Because it struck me as, one, small, and two, fake. I knew that woman wasn't a bigot for reasons that are actually quite specific that I won't share. And so, it's just, it was absurd, but that's not the way an awful lot of Black people feel. But yeah, it's not psychologically, I'm not going to say sound, because then people are going to say I'm saying that Black people are crazy. It is not a psychologically healthy way to be. And yet you and I are up against a whole crowd of people disproportionately represented in academia and the media who sincerely think that staged pessimism is somehow a progressive way to be, and perhaps the most interesting way to be a Black person. Doesn't work. It doesn't work. It needs to be called out.
Yeah, so this staged pessimism, it was brought to my mind recently. I was talking to my grandparents 2 weeks ago, and they were just telling stories. It was one of those priceless nights where they just tell all these stories that give a picture of a totally different world that was this world pretty recently in the 1950s. And he was telling a story about, being in the army and being at a base in the South and going to this kind of party in town. On the weekends, they would go into town and they would dance with girls and stuff, probably to a jazz band.
Dance with girls.
And he was the only Black person at this particular base, and he didn't want to be the only one not dancing with a girl, but he knew there was just a 0% chance of him being able to cross the color line and ask a white girl to dance. So he had to get his friends to bring my grandmother from DC out to Virginia so that he wouldn't be alone to dance. And it was just my point in bringing up this particular story, and it could be any story, is it's so clear that so much has changed in this country. I just think of what it's like for my grandfather to come to one of my shows and watch me effortlessly have friends of all races and have no hesitation to go up to a white girl and say hi, and just how different things are. And this was one of my entry points to being fascinated by what the hell is going on with the race conversation, particularly when I got to college, which is, why are people pretending that there hasn't been enormous progress? Like, what is the source of the false pretense that things are the same or even similar to how they were 30 years ago and certainly 60 years ago?
And you're asking the same question that led me to start pitching in on these things, because I had the same experience and was just thinking, all of these people, many of them smarter than me, are clearly looking at life as a Black person in 1990 as if it was 30 years ago. And they're wrong, and yet they're clearly not crazy, and they're not seeking any kind of power. I thought, what is it? Why is it that we see these things so differently? And what I found was, and this is still the case, a lot of people would tell you that what you're referring to is clearly real, but that we have to talk about, here it comes, systemic racism. And so they would say, well, look at the fact that in a school that requires a tough standardized test, there are practically no Black kids in it. Why is that? Especially when the school building is often in a brown neighborhood. Or they would say George Floyd. They would say it's the cops. What I found I think it would surprise many people to know that before I wrote Losing the Race, I did an informal but diligent kind of research, really wanting to know, why do you think that? Asking somebody who was very much in favor of pretending that O.J. Simpson was innocent, saying, what leads you to think, Kwame, that was his name, that the cops would have framed him in that particular way, given the, really, and listening, just listening to conversations. And I found that it's the cops. The main thing is the sense that the cops are Black people's enemy. If you got rid of that, then a lot of these staged pessimistic attitudes would melt away within a generation or even half. And so that's why I've tried to write as much as I can lately about the fact that what happened to George Floyd was hideous, but that there is also a major problem with the cops murdering white people. And that if we talk about the fact that Black men are murdered by cops disproportionately, I think you favor, and I understand this, the explanation that for reasons we can talk about, Black men commit more crimes. I tend to say that, but also Black men are disproportionately poor, and poverty brings anybody into contact with the cops. But the story that George Floyd is it, that happens to him, but with a white guy, they would have just pushed the same person up against the wall and said some sharp words. It's not true, as we know from the fact that the very white Tony Timpa died under conditions very similar to George Floyd's 4 years before. And nobody ever heard about Tony Timpa beyond a few local news reports in Texas at the time, until last year when some people, and I would venture to say I'm one of them, started calling attention to that case. But it was hardly unusual. But yeah, a lot of it is the cops, but then the cops enables, in the definition too of that word, the whole temptation of the professional victim complex. And that's where you get the idea that even people like you and me are walking around in eternal danger of being roughed up by the cops for no particular reason. We're supposed to say that. And I'm sure you have encountered, I know you've encountered at Columbia, Black men who claim that and act it out. And I certainly have heard it. And we both also know that that claim is vastly exaggerated, but it's why it's so attractive. The victim complex is attractive to any kind of human being. It's very easy to fall into it in our current climate if you are a Black person. That current climate began in roughly 1966, and here we are still mired in it.